First of all, I'd like to thank Nick for the invitation, to come and speak to the symposium. As Nick mentioned, I am a professor of politics at the University of Exeter. I am also the director of the Exeter Q-Step Centre, and I am leading a project that is attempting to understand how individuals are exposed to news and information in this new media environment. So how do social media and traditional media, how are citizens now exposed to those bits of information? And this project, yes, we are interested in social media and media in general, but the motivating question for the project is really about the quality of information. This is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, or it's been attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Now, I don't think Thomas Jefferson was talking about the monetization of information based on the Facebook or Google model. What he was talking about was the exchange of information in order to have democracy function appropriately. There has to be an exchange of information. Citizens need to inform representatives what their policy positions are. Representatives need to inform citizens what their positions are as well. And at a bare minimum, in terms of democratic theory, citizens need to have the information available to evaluate parties in terms of performance on key issues so that they know who to blame and who to reward and who to punish and who to give credit to at the next election. So information in that sense is an exchange between citizens and representatives, and quality information is important for democracy. Nick gave a great introduction to the issues surrounding this current rhetoric and current debate about fake news. For me, I shy away from using fake news to describe what I see as misinformation. For me, fake news is a rhetorical strategy of politicians like Trump to be critical and to criticize the media, which are trying to seek out the truth or report accurately on Trump's and his behavior and his policies. So I will shy away from using fake news to describe what I see as sort of misinformation or propaganda. And also to reflect the idea that Nick introduces that politicians have been lying to the public for a very long time. The media have been misreporting for a very long time. So what has changed? And there are some things that have changed about the information environment. So if we look at the types of news that I will be talking about in the next half hour or so, it's not about satire. This is obviously false, but it's satirical. And it does not count sort of as misinformation, or we would not confuse it as an attempt to misinform the public. This, you may remember this from the Brexit campaign. This was a headline from The Sun. Later, there was a complaint filed against it, and the complaint against this was upheld by IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization. Poor journalism. It was reported with only an unnamed source. Misinformation. Is it fake news? This is another headline, again from the press. This is a claim that was fact-checked, and there's a long, on fullfact.org, there's a long explanation about this is not a factually based claim. The evidence is contrary to that. This is fake news, or what we would see as fake news. This is a story that was run during the US presidential election. It was fake news generated about Hillary Clinton wearing a hearing aid during or hearing device during the debate. It's generated by a fake news site that's been identified as a fake news site So this is fake news. Other bits, they're sometimes talked about in terms of fake news, which I think is useful because it gets us talking about misinformation, but I would not classify it necessarily as fake news. And recently, I believe it was in a post on BuzzFeed, somebody commented that in the UK, we don't really need fake news sites because we have the partisan press. And you may see, you see evidence of that. Now, what I think has changed, and what I would argue has changed, and what others have noted has changed, is the structure in which we are exposed to information. We have moved from a system where there's a unidirectional flow of information from political elites to the media covering them, and then it's disseminated to the public. I, as a child, remember tuning into the evening news broadcasts. Of course, you can tell by my accent I'm an American, so I had a choice of 3 evening news broadcasts, and my parents in the household would have a newspaper, and we would read that. So it was a unidirectional flow of information. Now we know in the current media environment, the flow is not unidirectional. There is this process of sharing content. We share stories on social media platforms. Also, the aspect of user-generated content. That has changed as well. And that, I think, is where it becomes difficult to know which sources to trust, which are experts, which are based on expert reports, and which have been fact-checked before they go out in the public. So the usual gatekeepers the usual gatekeepers that we would think in terms of accurate information, those are not, they're there because we have online news sources, but generally they are overwhelmed by user-generated content. So what this means is that that citizens will have difficulty evaluating what is accurate information, what's true, and what is to be trusted information. Also, the speed at which information is shared has increased, and the speed at which the agenda changes and is set has also increased. Another outcome of the structure of this new media environment is increased selectivity. We know back then even that people paid attention to news and information that was consistent with their own prior beliefs. That avoidance of information that may conflict with what you believe is much easier in that environment. So people have argued that this increased selectivity has led to phenomena such as echo chambers or filter bubbles, and that is polarizing the public because all we see is information that reinforces what we believe in. So I want to show you an example of how quickly information can spread on social media. And in that sense, how the agenda or how the narrative, a particular narrative, can be amplified, and if it can be amplified, how it can be skewed as well. So what you'll see is how this tweet from the real Donald J. Trump Twitter account spread in the Twitter sphere. All right, so this was not, and this is a factual tweet. This is not one of his more controversial tweets, which is attacking the media or putting forward a false claim. This was a tweet taken from November 2016 after he had been elected, but before he became president, and it was announcing some of his appointments. So what I'll show you is how quickly that original tweet, the big red dot, spread on Twitter sphere. So you can see it being retweeted, it's being shared. We're not even to a second yet, it's got 200 replies, it's going. Some of these are obviously bots, which are created Twitter accounts, fake Twitter accounts, which are spreading the information. You also see in there some of the larger dots are those in the network which are having a great influence because their tweets are being shared more often. So you can see how quickly it's spreading. where the nodes of influence are, and then it's slowing down, and we're only to 23, 24 seconds there, and how you can see how quickly it spreads. Now that is also what we see happening with false claims that come from Twitter accounts as well. And just to emphasize that in there you have real people on Twitter, but you also have bots who are tweeting and retweeting that and carrying it forward. So what happens when that narrative, and if it's a false narrative, spreads so quickly? We know that the media respond, the traditional media respond to what is on Twitter. Increasingly, that is driving what is on the news media agenda. Also think about trying to correct that narrative. Once it's been spread that quickly, and people's attention, once you've paid it, you've noted it, you move on to the next thing, how difficult it would be to correct that narrative. Once you go back and find out, you do your fact checking, it's very difficult to go back and correct that narrative. So what we are trying to understand then is how this new environment influences exposure to information. And we do this not by looking solely at Twitter or at Facebook. I know some very reasonable people who are not on Twitter and who are not on Facebook. And we simply do not capture what they are exposed to if we only look at social media. And we are getting quite a censored view of what is out there when we only focus on social media. So the data that we've been looking at lately, I refer to them as digital crumbs or as Clickstream data. We have a sample of respondents who have agreed to download an app on their device and have their information or where they go online tracked for us. And then we merge that with survey data. So we're able to assess attitudinal measures through survey items and then link that to their online behavior. So this we believe will give us a fuller view of what information people are exposed to. And so let me give you an example. This was the most shared news story during on social media platforms in the Brexit campaign. And this was data that was generated from BuzzMo, which is, I believe, a affiliate of BuzzFeed, which tracks social media sharing. And this was the most shared story on social media. But is that the story that most people saw during the campaign? And what we saw when we looked at the Clickstream data for the week leading up to the Brexit vote, the EU referendum, back in 2016, is these were the most clicked on sites of the sample of respondents that we had. So by far, the BBC was the most viewed site. And in terms of where we think about, if we think about the partisan press or we think about these fake news sites, I'm quite optimistic when I see that people were clicking on the BBC most often. And then down you see sort of online news sources. Now this was having to go through a bunch of Clickstream data because unlike those of us in this room, most people spend a limited amount of time looking for news and information online. So what are they doing online? Shopping, entertainment. They're not looking at news and information sites. But when we get rid of the rest of the data, this is where they were clicking in the week before the campaign. And you may have a question later about why is the Manchester Evening News featured so prominently on that list? And I'll give you our answer if you ask that question later. So this gives us a different picture of what people are seeing. Social media was the story about remaining in the EU, killing the NHS. Here we see quite a different picture. And so this shows us, though, once we link that Clickstream data to the survey data, what different groups were doing online during that week before the campaign, which is the blue bar, and then what they were doing online in a week in April, just for a comparator purpose, for the purposes of comparison. And so what we see, for those who expressed a preference for leave, they are seeking out information. And those who expressed a preference for remain, they're also online looking at information. It's those undecideds who are not using or who are not sort of clicking on news and information sites. Now, this is not to say that they're undecided because they're not seeking out information. This simply gives you a profile of what each of these groups is doing online. There's no sort of causal inference being made here. So they're online. Each of these groups are online. And those who are decided are seeing more information online. Now, of that online activity, the BBC, as you saw in the first chart, the BBC was the most clicked on site. So what those people who were clicking on was this page. Okay? And we find that by going back, by using this useful tool on the internet, which is called the Wayback Machine. So if we're looking at the data now in 2017 or in September of 2017, how do we know what was on the internet back in 2016? We can use the Wayback Machine. And using that, what we come up with was this is the most clicked on news and information URL during that week leading up to the campaign. People were going there to find out, to get an update of the EU referendum campaign. Quite a bit different than that most shared story from the headline from the Daily Express. Okay. What we're also able to do is from the Clickstream data is to sort out what types of URLs people were going to. So what we've done is to compress into left-leaning papers, right-leaning papers, and broadcast organizations, and look at how the different Leave, Remain, undecided groups were viewing those different sources of information. Again, because we're interested in whether or not online activity is polarizing people. That is one of, as I suggested, that is one of the phenomena that people describe as being an outcome of the new media environment, is increased polarizing views that people are exposed to, and then increasingly polarized attitudes. So what we see here is amongst those who said they were had a preference for leave, and again, this is the week leading up to the campaign, their news and information views online were dominated largely by conservative-leaning papers. However, they were still looking at labor-leaning papers, and they were looking at the BBC. So they weren't looking at conservative papers to the exclusion of these other sources. You see that the Remain group has had a more sort of balanced profile in terms of which URLs they were looking at. A lot of clicks on the BBC, but also looking at labor-leaning papers and conservative-leaning papers. Now, again, I'm not suggesting here causality between them having a more balanced news diet and therefore voting Remain. We're simply looking at the profiles, online profiles of these people who have identified themselves as Leavers or Remainers. And that's quite a varied group in the Remain side. And you see that in online activity. And then the activity from the undecided and don't knows, how that distributes across conservative and labor-leaning papers as well. Okay? So I think I would argue that what we see when we look at all sorts of online activity and exposure to all different sorts of information, what we see is a less polarized exposure than one would expect if we're looking simply at social media and assuming that people are generating these echo chambers or these filter bubbles. possibly reason for some hope. Okay. Now, when people are exposed to information or misinformation, one of the worries that we have, of course, is that it influences opinion. But we also know that people select to view certain types of information, and that may be misinformation that is connected with and consistent with what they believe. And we would want to be able to correct any misperceptions that citizens might have in order that they might more accurately make decisions or make more informed decisions. So I want to talk about some of the effects of trying to correct people's misperceptions. And increasingly online and via social media and via these websites, we see attempts to check the facts and to get those fact checks out to citizens and the public. And news sites have their own fact-checking or reality check sites. BBC, Channel 4. There are also independent fact-checking organizations like Factcheck. One of my favorites is called Pants on Fire in the US. They actually fact-check politicians' claims, and they give ratings to, if it's a really outright lie, then they give it a Pants on Fire rating. Full Fact is the UK's independent fact-checking organization, and I think Snopes is another one which people turn to and which is quite useful at checking claims. People are using these sites. There's a lot of traffic to these sites, so there is a sense that people want accurate information. Are these fact-checking organizations or these run by broadcasters, can they be effective at correcting misperceptions? We wanted to investigate that in around the 2017 election. So we conducted an experiment with our respondents. These are the same respondents, or a similar set of respondents to the ones where I showed the Clickstream data. And what we did is we gave them a false claim. And we administered this to them in an online survey. And we gave this claim and a series of other false claims that were prominent in the last 3 elections that we've had. The NHS is under unprecedented pressure due to an influx of EU migrants that has forced doctors to take on 1.5 million extra patients in 3 years. These were all, this claim and the other ones we used, we took from fullfact.org. They've been fact-checked and found to be factually misleading. And then we asked them, do you believe, mostly believe, neither believe nor disbelieve, believe, or strongly believe this statement? So we asked them that, and then we gave them, after they expressed whether or not they believed in it or not, we gave them the correction. And I have to say, for these experiments, these fact-checking experiments, have been conducted for quite a while. What we attempted to do in this experiment was replicate what a very complicated situation and what we thought was going on in the real world. So it was quite a complicated correction. I've just given a bit of it. A fact-checking organization. We did vary the source of the correction for the respondent. Fact-checking organization, Telegraph or The Guardian, that could have been the source of the fact check. And then it was explained that further information has been supplied, and that the story in the correction is really that there's many other pressures on the NHS, and immigration is a very tiny one if you think about the additional money. So that was the correction that we ran. So the respondents read that correction. And then we asked them again, do you believe, we gave them the statement again, and then we asked, do you believe it? And what we found is that the correction did make a difference. The correction, if you read the correction, once they read the correction, the claim became less believable. Okay? And you can see that the source, I should explain that to a group we also gave no correction. And in that group that did not receive a correction, the statement was as believable. But for the fact-checking organization, the Telegraph and the Guardian, the green triangle represents the believability after the correction. So the believability declined, which is what we would expect if the information, the correction, had an effect. It should become less believable. So it does work. I think it's interesting to note that what is seen as the independent fact-checking organization really had less of an effect on reducing the believability than the Telegraph or the Guardian. Okay? So we do see some evidence that misperceptions can be corrected. What do you think these corrections last? Good. It's a good question to ask, and it's one that we had. It's a question that we asked. Do these corrections last? So we went back. This was conducted prior to the election in June. We went back in July and asked about the believability of the statement. You can see it decline. What happens in July when we asked them about the believability of this statement? No reminder of the correction. So does it last? The yellow dot represents believability in the follow-up. Okay? So there is it doesn't last to the extent that it had an effect right after the treatment. They are slightly lower than the believability before treatment, but in general, people are regressing back toward the original statement, except in the case of the Guardian. And I will generally, that's a bit the believability is higher. I'm going to come back to the Guardian in a minute. But I think we all have an understanding of why these corrections might fail. And that really has to do with what we understand to be the nature of the relationship between information and attitudes. Back in the 60s, we thought people didn't have opinions. The media wouldn't have an effect generally on vote preferences because people voted on the basis of partisan loyalties. And every bit of information that they saw in the media, news information, was really seen through the psychological lens of party loyalties. I think we might be coming back to a model of citizen judgment that looks a little bit like that. Then we thought citizens were just uninformed. They didn't have a lot of factual information. And this is true, they don't have a lot of factual information. So how do they make good judgments? Then we thought about the information shortcuts that they use in order to make political judgments, which reduces the impact of bias on those judgments. And those information shortcuts are things like partisan loyalties and party identification, which help us make better decisions. Now we're in a state where we think people are misinformed, so they have factually incorrect beliefs, but they're also being fed a diet of factually incorrect information. And how do they process that factually incorrect information? We tend to think of citizens as motivated reasoners. And this is, again, getting to the point of why we think corrections fail. There is this notion of selectivity. I don't need to adjust my beliefs because I've chosen to pay attention to that news which is consistent with my beliefs. And if we think about motivated reasoning, people are motivated by certain goals. And it happens to be in politics, they're not generally motivated by an accuracy goal. They tend to be motivated by goals which is a consistency goal. So they want, when they encounter new information, they process that information, or the strategies that they use once they're motivated to make that new information consistent with their prior beliefs. So in a sense, if it's inconsistent, they discount it, and there will be no updating of beliefs. So it's a very conservative strategy, and again, it's not motivated by accuracy. We might be motivated by accuracy when we go out and decide which car to buy. We might view all the information. We might want to make the most accurate decision, but generally in politics, we're not motivated by that accuracy goal. And when we process the information, then our prior beliefs, our prior experiences, our affect, our emotion help us process that information. So here, when emotion becomes part of the process and part of the diet that goes into a political judgment. So we really can't get away from emotion because that is part of how we come to make political judgments. So the idea, what I'm interested here in this, before I move on to it, is how then in this experiment that we did, where I've shown you the results, if we take into account this idea of motivated reasoning, are certain people more difficult to correct than others? Are those that have partisan beliefs or are strongly held partisan beliefs more difficult to correct than others? So what we've done is to look at the data, we didn't look at it by partisan support, but we looked at it by the newspaper people said they most paid attention to. This was a voluntary response that they gave. So we feel that if they gave the Guardian or the Telegraph, they're quite committed to that paper. And again, we're asking, are these people more difficult to move who are more committed to a particular news source? And you'll note that the claim itself that the NHS is under undue pressure due to immigration is a claim that's more consistent with people on the right and conservative views than it is with people on the left. So in that sense, that claim, again, is more consistent with that position. So keep that in mind when we look at how this is for those who are reading a conservative-leaning paper, how the fact-checking and the correction affected them. What we see is there's quite high believability in that claim prior to the correction and after the correction. There's no real significant effect of the fact check on your belief in that statement if you're reading a conservative paper. And that is true for the Telegraph, which would be your trusted source of news, has very little impact or no significant impact on the correction. Okay, so note, high believability in that claim, very little effect of the correction, no significant effect. Let's look at the labor-leaning papers. What we see is that overall, there's lower believability in the claim. So from the start, people who read The Guardian just believe less in the claim. Okay? It's a bit of information that may not be consistent with their beliefs, so it's easier to resist. And we see, though, that in this case, the fact-checking, et cetera, didn't move your believability. But where we saw believability move was from The Guardian. So if you were in the group that got the correction that was sourced as The Guardian, it had a significant effect on believability. It moved it in a significant way. So in that sense, for The Guardian readers, at least in this sample, which is a subsample of our entire the respondents who got it, it did have an effect. Okay? Again, we'll think of it as a trusted source, but on a bit of information, on a correcting of a fact or a claim that was already not consistent with their beliefs. Okay? So in a sense, they might be easier to move because it was inconsistent with their beliefs. Now, why are we concerned about misinformation and the ability or the inability to correct it? We're concerned about it and how it's spread on social media and through the new media environment. We're concerned because we think it leads to a polarization in political attitudes and values. And we see this in the U.S. case. These are data from the U.S. where it shows that the median Democrat and the median Republican, those positions are moving further and further apart. Okay? Now that's one, so polarized attitudes. We also think that, or the effect here too, is that you become more negative about the group that you're not in. So not only has polarization increased, but Democrats are more negative about Republicans, and Republicans are more negative about Democrats. It's become uncivil. And this same claim has been made about the citizenry or society in the UK pre-Brexit and post-Brexit. It's becoming more polarized between social groups. The second problem, so polarization in attitudes, and I think the second problem is that there's an increase in anti-democratic values, or a noted increase in anti-democratic values. These are data that were reported in the Journal of Democracy, and then a story was done in the Washington Post, because it's quite extraordinary. These data are from different cohorts, birth cohorts, so cohort born in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then finally, the final cohort, where a point is estimated, was born in the 80s. And this is the percentage of people in each of those cohorts who say it's essential to live in a democracy. So we see this decline in people increasingly who say it's not essential to live in a democracy. Okay. What is the influence of misinformation, the inability to trust information, the inability to trust political leaders, have on this decline in democratic values? And I think that is really worrying. Is this what we see as evidence of deconsolidation in long-established democracies? So I think this is where we need to sort of focus some attention as well, is the links between fake news, misinformation, how it's spread on the internet, and how then eventually we get to this point of anti-democratic values. So just to conclude, I think there are some hopeful things from the data that the group that I work with at the University of Exeter, some hopeful news, and some worrying news. I think the worrying news, again, but this has been demonstrated before, that it's difficult to correct misperceptions, particularly when they're long-held predispositions and they're based on emotional attachments to parties or ideologies. It's difficult to correct those. But I think the hope from the experiment that we ran is that the source, a trusted source, can go some way in correcting it. And also I should note that there was a correction effect. It just didn't seem to last that long. So with repeated corrections, perhaps then misperceptions can be corrected. The other bit of hopeful news to take away, I think, is that the news diet, the online news diet, is not as polarized as those who talk about the echo chamber and the filter bubble would have us believe. I think our data show that it's that polarization, if you look at all news sources, not just social media, that it's a bit more balanced. It's not as polarized as we would expect. So those, I think, are some conclusions to take away, and also some things to think about in terms of the fake news debate. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. If you'd like to stay here, I think we'll just do 10 minutes of questions and discussion before moving on to the next panel. I think we have some microphones we can roam around with down here. So if you put your hand up and say who you are and ask a question, that would be great. What I'll do, actually, I'll take, gentleman at the back first. Can we see up there? Yeah.
So just to say first, thank you for your talk. My question was just about why was the Manchester Evening News so far up the list?
Why does the Manchester Evening News feature so prominently in our thing? First of all, we have some very enthusiastic Manchester people in our sample who clicked on it. But once we do get, and these were outliers, we get rid of them. We think it's a process of redirects, perhaps from the Guardian, but also just having to do with who was in our sample. But I didn't think it was honest to take it out entirely because I couldn't explain it, so I left it in. But you can see that the rest of them are quite consistent in terms of what we would expect in terms of online viewing of news and information.
I think the Manchester Evening News would just say it's a brilliant newspaper with a great website. Gentleman here, yes, you. Can we get a mic to the middle there? Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I would like to ask about the last slide when you showed the anti-democratic behavior.
Yeah.
I had difficulties to understand the relationship with the misinformation and fake news, especially that the data are until 80. So my understanding that such behavior of misinformation and fake news starts with the social media and so on. So how we could prove that there is a relationship between this decline and the era of fake news?
Okay. I apologize because I have a very long answer to that question. My answer really is that this polarization due to structural changes in the media system happens before really the advent of social media. Okay? And in a really, really good book that outlines how the structure of our media choices can influence our attitudes, written in the 2000, by Marcus Pryor. It's called Post-Broadcast Democracy. Okay? He talks about how the structure in the media system in the US, with the introduction of things like talk radio, cable television, where you have Fox News, that is where we see increasing where increasing selectivity increases. So that is before the advent of social media and Web 2.0, and those changes in the environment led to increasingly polarized attitudes amongst the electorate and potentially anti-democratic values. Now, I've not examined this effect on anti-democratic values necessarily, but what it is, it's not those, is that last point is the data come from 2012. It's just that the cohort was born in the 1980s. So the data are from 2010, I believe. So the idea in this article is that increasingly this generation born in the 80s, exposed to this myriad of sources on social media and on the internet, again, no gatekeepers, where's the truth, where's the accuracy, that potentially might be an explanation for it. And also, I think they would argue that political leaders have not stepped into the void or have not attempted to fill the gatekeeper role and to say, no, this is what I meant, this is accurate. Because we know from vote models and party models that political parties benefit in some respects from a lack of clarity about information as well.
Although presumably this data would also be correlate with declines in party membership and parties and loyalties, and so broader structures of change in the party systems and democratic participation. Yeah,
that is an excellent point. And that we see the changes in the media structure, but at the same time, we see decline in party membership, increasing distrust, all sorts of other long-term trends going on at the same time, and trying to sort out what is the result of social media, what has led, which of these has led to increased misinformation being disseminated. Those are big questions and important ones as well.
Okay, can I, let me just see if I've got a woman I can ask. No, okay. Down here, and then I'll come up to you,
Yes, my question is also about this chart. Your previous bit was about believability. I find it very difficult to believe that 75% of people in their 30s don't believe it's essential to live in a democracy across the West. What were the other options that were given to them? What's the definition of essential to live in a democracy? Yeah, very good question. I will say that this was roundly distributed on my, and you may have come across it on your social media feed.
this story, the article in the Journal of Democracy, and then picked up in the Washington Post. Clearly, their story was, or their take on it, their narrative of it, was that we're really being let down by the youth. Okay? That was the conclusion. It's these young people that we have to blame for deconsolidation, for authoritarian leaders, et cetera. Now, you're exactly right. What were the other options? When you actually, and I put this up to be a bit provocative, and obviously, being the last slide, it has to provoke discussion. The problem with the data is that it's a 10-point scale. Okay, so there are other options on that scale. And what you see is a decline in the people who are, what they're plotting here are the top two answers about it's very essential, and then that's point 10, and then the one back down from there. Okay, so at the extreme, then these the newer generations are not giving those extreme answers on that it's essential to live in democracy scale. When you look at the averages, which takes into account the whole range of answers, you don't see such a dramatic decline. But then it's not such a nice story, is it?
Okay, let's take a few questions because we've only got 5 minutes left. So our gentleman here first, and then we'll go up the back. Yeah. No, so the microphone coming? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Nello Cristianini from the University of Bristol. I have a question about the experiment you reported in the beginning. So you only followed mainstream media, you removed the social media, and you wanted to see how much people accessed media to the app. Two questions. What about news aggregators?
Yep.
And the second is, of course, mainstream medias do have recommendation systems built in, so the feedback loop, the echo chamber, is very much at work within the BBC, within the Guardian. They know your past browsing history, they recommend. You don't just explain away the feedback loop because the filter bubble, because you removed the social media. And second is related to sample size, please.
Yeah.
How many people?
Yeah. Okay, so the data that you referred to are not part of an experiment. They're just, we've done the survey and then we have the Clickstream data. And we have not removed social media. So in the clicks that you see, or the URLs that I've plotted on that chart, what you're seeing are people who have got to those URLs either from a social media platform, or from a news aggregator, or from directly clicking on it, or from a search engine. So we've captured those 4 different ways in which they could have arrived at that URL. What I've not shown you is how many people arrived at the BBC from Twitter versus a news aggregator versus other sources. Okay? So we have not removed social media. What we've removed are non-news and information sites. And you're right, just from what I've plotted, I can't dismiss the idea that there's a feedback loop or a filter chamber. And actually, when I haven't brought the slide today, but when we plot the network structures of the data that we have, you can see some networks, and you can see the possibility of feedback and echo chambers, but it is nowhere near what you see when you just restrict yourself to looking at shares on social media. That's our argument. And we see a difference between sort of the networks around shared URLs versus the networks around shared stories.
Sample size.
Oh, sample size. For the URLs, that's 1,154. For the experiment in the first wave, we're looking at, again, another 1,000 respondents. Yeah.
Okay, so gentleman here, and then come to
the NHS immigration story and the chart you had. Now, it wasn't clear to me what the values down the left actually meant.
Okay, yeah.
But on the face of it, an awful lot of people still believe the story after the correction. Did you ask people why they believe the story still, having been told by an organisation probably with similar views to theirs, a paper, that they still thought it was true?
No, we did not. But that's a really good bit of evidence that we should be collecting. Is you've been given this, and generally what the process, a motivated reasoner might say is that information is is not correct, or I can discount it somehow. So they would reason against it, and they would try to figure out why it wasn't true. The same claim has been made about people who smoke, and the evidence that they're given that smoking is dangerous, is how they reason against that information. But a very, very useful question, a useful next bit of research.
Sorry, so Lynn, if you come next, and then I've missed some people up the top, so I just want to get to them.
Okay. To be a bit provocative, I'm thinking back. I liked your slide because I was in the era of the 60s where I lived, we had 2 television stations because you couldn't get the rabbit ears to get the third. And so we all watched Walter Cronkite. So my worldview and my family's in the 1960s was Walter Cronkite. Same with the BBC. They decided who could listen to music. And I would say, even though we've got a lot of varying facts in it, perhaps this massive amount of information, good and bad, is true democracy, as opposed to not being good for democracy.
Interesting point.
So yes, that's the great hope, right? That was the great hope of the internet, is access to all sorts of information, and that there wouldn't be a gatekeeper. There wouldn't be a gatekeeper there saying, this is what you need to know, and this is, and that's the great hope of the internet. And I would agree that that's the other side of the story. And that's where we hope to move with the data that we are collecting, is to pull out are people, what sorts of, when they click on these URLs, are they reading and processing the accurate information and ignoring the rubbish? And we see also this happening on social media, where people react to false claims. There was the thing that went around Twitter about where was Obama, they were criticizing Trump for not being there in Houston with the latest hurricane, and so it came out, well, where was Obama then in Hurricane Katrina? Why was he not at Hurricane Katrina? Well, we know he wasn't there because he wasn't the president. And there was there was no, and actually he was in New Orleans. He wasn't the president, but he was there. And there was a big upswell of the crowd, if you will, correcting that bit of information. So in that sense, I share with you a great hope, and that if we do remove the gatekeepers. Now, on the other side of that, this is quite some people do have nostalgia for that version, for the Walter Cronkite, and also the idea that we all have a shared experience of the news. If there are only 2 or 3 stations to watch and everybody's tuned into it, we all have a shared experience of what the story is on the news of the previous night. And we can continue then with a conversation the next day around whatever, in whatever environment, about that news story of the day. So thank you for the,
Okay, one last question. I hadn't got to yes, you there, at the back. Thank you. Sorry if I've missed anybody. We'll try and come to you.
So presumably one of the reasons why people are not willing to accept fact-checking and that kind of information is because there's a psychological consequence of admitting that you've been wrong. You want your views to be consistent, and you want to be confident in your views' consistency, and constantly changing your mind every time that you're presented with a new piece of information can be damaging to that confidence. So I just wanted to know, have you looked at that at all, and are there any ways that fact-checking can be made more effective by reducing the kind of damage to people's self-confidence in their own abilities of reasoning, I suppose? Yeah,
and what you've described, why people are resistant to it, is exactly the idea behind motivated reasoning, is that people are made anxious when their views are, when they're confronted with inconsistent information, and they're motivated to reduce that anxiety, and therefore they reason about that new information that may be consistently in order to discount it and make it consistent with their own. Now, some of the research that's been done in terms of what makes corrections more acceptable are things around the source. So trusted sources seem to be a bit more effective. And I think also there was at least one experiment done around giving people positive news and then giving them the correction. So if you first put them in a positive mood and then correct their misperceptions, they're more likely to update their beliefs with the new information. So it's a bit, you know, their sense of it sort of removes the anxiety and allows them then to update their beliefs with the new accurate information. So there are some things that can be done sort of on that side with the source of information or how it's delivered. There's also the sense on the other side in terms of what journalists or the news media might think about, and that has to do with the frequency of the correction. People, a lot can be done in terms of how familiar the correction is. So if you keep correcting, and that becomes a source, or that becomes the narrative or the discourse, is that this is wrong and this is the correction, that can also help. So it's those sorts of things lead to better corrections.
Great. Okay, well, Susan, thank you very much indeed. It's a great way to start our symposium. Okay, so we're going to move into